The BFG by Roald Dahl. Pictures by Quentin Blake. Capture.
"Which of you foul pastors is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you rotsome man-hugger?"
Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leaped to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse.
"Human beings!" the flesh lump eater yelled. "What is all you flesh-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beings doing in our country?"
He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand.
"I is having early suppers today," he shouted,
holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching, horror-struck. "Do something," she cried. "Quick, before he eats him."
"Put that human being down," the BFG shouted.
The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG.
"What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets?" he bellowed. "You is making me very suspicious."
The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly, she undid it.
"I is guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I is guzzling up 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You is not getting away from me ever, because I is galloping 50 times faster than you."
Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch-long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You is bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome poisonous viper. It was a dreadly dangerous windshield viper."
"Save our souls," bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets. I is bitten by a septitious, venomous windshield viper."
He flopped to the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch.
"The teeth of the dreadly viper is still sticking into me," he yelled. "I is feeling the teeth sticking into my ankle."
The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise, you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That will stop the poisonous juices from the venomous viper going up your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both his hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venomous viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie his ankle and hands together with a tight knot. "I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I is pizened to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done, you!" cried Sophie. "Well done, you!" said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all of our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmozzle. "When you is only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you is sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the Army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move?" "Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams," the BFG said. "We can't waste time with that rubbish," the Army general said. "It is the Queen's order," Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got there?" the head of the Army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. "I is flush-bunked," roared the flesh lump eater. "I is split-wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "I is swog-swalloped," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I is gunzel-swiped," shouted the meat dripper. "I is goose-gruggled," howled the man-hugger. "I is fluck-gungled," screamed the maid-masher. "I is slop-groggled," squawked the gizzard-gulper. "I is crod-swinkled," yowled the blood-bottler. "I is bop-muggered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over them. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned out by the sound of the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them onto the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking.